December 19th, 1944. A converted French army barracks in Verdun, still scarred by a war fought a generation earlier. Inside the room, the highest commanders of the Allied Expeditionary Force sit around a long table. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower is present. So are Generals Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, and the senior operational leadership of the Western Front. No one is smiling. 3 days earlier, before dawn on December 16th, the German army had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by armored divisions and concentrated artillery, smashed into thin American lines along an 80-mile front. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. U.S. divisions assigned to what had been considered a quiet sector were overrun, encircled, or shattered in place. Communications collapsed. Command posts lost contact with subordinate units. Entire regiments disappeared from the map. By the time Eisenhower convened the emergency conference at Verdun, the situation was no longer theoretical. It was operationally dangerous. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in southern Belgium, was surrounded. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division, along with attached armor and artillery, were encircled by German forces pressing toward the Meuse River. If Bastogne fell, German armor could maneuver freely along interior road networks. The Allied front could be split. The northern and southern armies separated. The entire Western campaign destabilized. Eisenhower understood the stakes immediately. The problem was not intent, it was time. Winter conditions, frozen roads, snow-choked forests, and exhausted units made rapid maneuver appear impossible. Every major Allied formation was facing the wrong direction. The margin for decision was no longer measured in weeks, it was measured in hours. In the days before the German attack, the Allied command believed the war in the West was entering its final phase. Paris had been liberated. Most of France was secure. The Allied armies were pressing toward the German frontier from multiple directions. The prevailing assessment at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was simple. Germany no longer possessed the strength, fuel, or reserves for a large-scale offensive. Intelligence summaries emphasized exhaustion. German units were described as under strength, short on fuel, short on ammunition, and increasingly defensive in posture. The Ardennes sector, held by American divisions new to combat or recovering from previous fighting, was considered suitable for rest. This judgment rested on precedent and probability. The Ardennes was rugged, forested, cut by narrow roads, and difficult to supply in winter. Launching a major armored offensive there in December appeared irrational. But assumptions harden quickly in war. Once the belief took hold that Germany could no longer attack, every new piece of information was filtered through that lens. German radio silence in certain sectors was interpreted as weakness. The disappearance of divisions from the line was explained away as consolidation or reserve positioning. Prisoner interrogations that hinted at movement were dismissed as rumor or confusion. No single report sounded the alarm. The failure was cumulative, structural, and quiet. By early December, Allied planners were already discussing timelines for final victory. Some commanders believed the war might be over by Christmas. In that context, warnings did not feel urgent. They felt inconvenient. Across the front, staffs focused on their immediate objectives. Maps were oriented east. Supply flows moved forward, not laterally. No one was planning to turn an army around. No one, except one headquarters, was asking what would happen if the assumption was wrong. December 9th, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Colonel Oscar W. Koch, the G2 intelligence officer of the U.S. 3rd Army, entered General George S. Patton's office carrying a thick stack of reports. Koch was not dramatic by nature. He was methodical, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with conclusions that rested on assumption rather than pattern. For weeks, he had been tracking German unit dispositions along the Western Front. Not individual battalions, not regiments, entire divisions. 15 German divisions had disappeared from Allied order of battle charts. These were not shattered remnants. They included several full-strength Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, formations that required fuel, rail movement, and deliberate concealment to relocate. At Supreme Headquarters, the explanation was administrative. The Germans were holding reserves to counter Allied breakthroughs. Nothing more. Koch did not accept that explanation. The Wehrmacht did not habitually hold 15 divisions idle in December 1944. That concentration represented offensive mass, not reaction. He spread his maps across Patton's desk. Rail movement indicators, intercept gaps, civilian reports from behind German lines, radio traffic patterns that had gone abruptly silent in some sectors and intensified in others. Koch pointed to the Ardennes, a sector held by 4 American divisions across a front that doctrine said required at least 3 times that number. The terrain was difficult, forested, constricted, poor for maneuver, which was exactly why Allied planners believed it safe. Koch reminded Patton of 1940. The Germans had attacked through the same forest, crossed the Meuse, and reached the Channel in 6 weeks. Patton listened without interruption. When Koch finished, Patton asked one question. "If you are right, when does the attack come?" Koch answered immediately. "Within 2 weeks." Patton's first call went to General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group. He laid out Koch's assessment calmly, without theatrics. Missing divisions, radio patterns inconsistent with defense, a concentration aimed at the Ardennes. Bradley listened, but he was unconvinced. Supreme Headquarters intelligence did not agree. The German army, in Bradley's view, no longer possessed the capability for a large-scale offensive. Fuel shortages, air superiority, and battlefield losses all pointed in one direction. Germany was losing, and losing badly. Bradley advised Patton not to worry. The reports, he said, did not justify alarm. When the call ended, Patton did not argue further. He turned back to Koch. Patton did not need consensus to prepare. He needed only the possibility that Koch was right. That afternoon, Patton issued a quiet order to his staff. Begin contingency planning for a German offensive in the Ardennes. The directive made no sense to anyone else in 3rd Army headquarters. The Army was actively engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region, pushing east toward Germany. Every plan, every supply flow, every artillery mission was oriented forward. Yet over the next 10 days, Patton's staff produced 3 complete operational plans. Each assumed a sudden requirement to disengage, pivot 90 degrees, and attack north. Routes were plotted down to individual road junctions. Fuel and ammunition requirements were calculated by the hour. Artillery battalions were assigned new firing positions before the need existed. Nothing was left flexible. Flexibility, Patton believed, was something you earned in advance. On December 12th, Patton briefed his senior commanders. He ordered them to be prepared to disengage on short notice. He did not explain why. They exchanged looks, but they complied. Preparation, after all, did not require belief. 5:30 a.m., December 16, 1944. Along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, German artillery opened fire. Thousands of shells struck American positions almost simultaneously. Telephone lines were severed. Radio nets collapsed. Command posts went dark. Then the infantry advanced, followed by armor moving through forest roads thought unusable in winter. 3 German armies surged forward. The 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army anchoring the southern flank. More than 200,000 men pressed into 4 American divisions. In many sectors, the Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1. Units assigned to rest areas found themselves fighting for survival within hours. Battalions were cut off before they understood they were under attack. At higher headquarters, the first reports were misread. Local counterattack, reconnaissance in force, nothing that required immediate theater-level response. It took most of the day for the pattern to emerge. German armor was not probing. It was driving west, toward river crossings, toward operational depth. At U.S. First Army headquarters, disbelief set in. Intelligence assessments from days earlier were now unusable. Maps no longer matched reality. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in the Ardennes, bore the brunt. 2 of its regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. It became the largest mass capture of American troops in the European theater. The German offensive had achieved what Allied planners believed impossible: operational surprise. At Supreme Headquarters, certainty dissolved into reaction. Orders were delayed because the scale of the attack was still unclear. At Third Army Headquarters, the reaction was different. Patton read the first reports and turned to Oscar Koch. "You were right." Patton summoned his staff immediately. The reports were fragmentary, but the direction was already clear. Oscar Koch studied the incoming messages, unit by unit, road by road. German spearheads were pushing toward Bastogne. The objective was not tactical. It was operational. Bastogne controlled the road network of southern Belgium. If it fell intact, German armor could maneuver freely toward the Meuse and beyond. Delay, there was everything. Patton issued his orders without raising his voice. Execute the contingency plans. Third Army began disengaging from active combat in the Saar that same day. Divisions already in contact with German forces were instructed to break off, reorient, and prepare to move north. This was not a withdrawal. It was a controlled pivot under pressure. Fuel allocations were rerouted. Ammunition scheduled for eastbound operations was redirected north. Truck companies that had been staged days earlier began loading on pre-assigned timelines. While other Allied headquarters were still debating the scope of the German attack, Third Army was already moving. Orders flowed because they already existed. Commanders did not ask for clarification because the routes had been rehearsed on paper. On December 18th, Bastogne was fully encircled. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division, attached armor, engineers, and artillery were cut off inside the town. Resupply by ground was impossible. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the situation was now unmistakable. The Germans had forced a penetration deep enough to threaten the cohesion of the Allied front. An emergency conference was scheduled for the following day in Verdun. Every senior commander was summoned. Patton prepared for the meeting, knowing something the others did not. He was not going to propose a plan. He was going to report one already in motion. December 19th, 1944, Verdun. The room was crowded with rank and exhaustion. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, flanked by the senior commanders of the Western Front. Maps covered the walls. Red arrows marked German advances that had not existed 3 days earlier. Eisenhower opened the meeting deliberately. He framed the situation not as disaster, but as opportunity. The German army, he said, had exposed itself by abandoning prepared defenses. But opportunity meant nothing without speed. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled, low on supplies, holding a road junction the Germans needed intact. If relief did not come soon, the town would fall. Eisenhower asked the central question: how soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? No one answered. Generals bent over their maps, calculating distances, road capacity, fuel consumption, weather, and the complexity of disengaging units already in combat. Turning a field army 90 degrees in winter conditions was not just difficult. It violated every instinct of operational caution. The silence stretched. Then George S. Patton spoke. He did not hedge. He did not qualify. He said he could attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours, 3 divisions in 72. Heads turned. Some officers assumed they had misheard him. Eisenhower fixed Patton with a long look. This was not the moment for bravado. "George," Eisenhower said, "this is no time for grandstanding. If we promise relief and cannot deliver, those men die." Patton did not raise his voice. "Ike," he replied, "I have already given the orders. Third Army is disengaging now. I have been expecting this attack for 11 days. The room went silent again. But this time, it was a different silence. Eisenhower studied Patton in silence. He had known him for decades. He knew the difference between confidence and calculation. Patton was not improvising. He was executing. "All right, George," Eisenhower finally said. "Get moving." Patton did not linger. He left the conference room and went straight to a telephone. The call went to 3rd Army headquarters, to his chief of staff. 2 words. "Play ball." Those words unlocked plans written days earlier. Within minutes, orders moved through 3rd Army's command network without confusion or debate. The 4th Armored Division began rolling north first. The 26th Infantry Division followed on assigned routes. Artillery battalions displaced according to pre-designated schedules. Fuel depots shifted priorities. Ammunition stocks were rerouted. Truck companies that had been staged in anticipation now moved on the hour they had already been assigned. More than 100,000 men began moving simultaneously. Over 130,000 vehicles were redirected through snow-covered roads, icy intersections, and narrow forest corridors. Units that had been in contact with the enemy that morning were on new axes of advance by nightfall. Commanders did not ask how this was possible. The answer was embedded in the orders themselves. While other Allied armies were still reorganizing and clarifying their understanding of the German offensive, 3rd Army was already in motion, not reacting, advancing. The movement began on the night of December 19th and did not pause. Convoys moved without headlights. March tables were enforced to the minute. This was not speed born of desperation. It was speed born of preparation. The movement north tested every assumption about what an army could endure. Snow covered the roads. Ice locked intersections into bottlenecks. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, stressing men and machines alike. Vehicles broke down in columns that stretched for miles. Engines failed. Tracks snapped. Tires froze hard against the road surface. March discipline kept the columns moving anyway. Patton's timetable did not adjust for comfort. It adjusted only for reality. By December 21st, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were nearing their jump-off positions south of Bastogne. They had moved more than 100 miles in less than 48 hours, while disengaging from combat and rerouting supply lines still under pressure. The German command did not expect this. Their planning assumed the Allies would require at least a week to reorient major formation. Their own offensive timetable depended on that delay. Instead, American armor was already forming for attack. On December 22nd, 3rd Army struck north. The attack unfolded through villages, forests, and frozen fields that favored defense. German units had established blocking positions along every approach. Tank engagements erupted at close range. Infantry advanced through woods thick with snow and defensive fire. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Inside Bastogne, the situation was critical. The 101st Airborne Division was low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Evacuation of wounded was nearly impossible. That same day, German commanders sent a surrender demand into the town. Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe's reply was brief. Nuts. The defenders held because they believed relief was coming. Outside the perimeter, 3rd Army was fighting to make that belief true. December 26th, 1944, late afternoon. The relief column moved through rolling ground south of Bastogne, where German forces had anchored their defense along villages and tree lines. Every approach road was covered, every intersection contested. At the front of the advance was the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. Its lead vehicle, a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King, pushed forward despite repeated fire and stalled vehicles blocking the road. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus commanded the tank. His orders were simple and unforgiving. Drive until you reach Bastogne, or you cannot drive anymore. At approximately 4:50 p.m., Cobra King broke through German positions near the village of Eisenhower. Moments later, it made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne Division on the outskirts of Bastogne. The siege was broken. The corridor was narrow, vulnerable, and under constant attack. German units struck at its flanks repeatedly, attempting to sever it before it could stabilize. Third Army held it anyway. That night, supply convoys rolled into Bastogne. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Wounded men were evacuated for the first time in 8 days. Inside the town, the defenders understood what the breakthrough meant. They were no longer isolated. They could fight on. Patton received the confirmation and immediately called Eisenhower. "We're through to Bastogne." The larger battle was not over. German forces would continue fighting for weeks and casualties would continue to mount. But the German timetable was already broken. The speed of Third Army's response had collapsed the operational logic of the Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge did not end with the relief of Bastogne. Fighting continued into January, across frozen ground littered with the wreckage of both armies. Casualties mounted on all sides. For the United States Army, it became the bloodiest battle of the war. More than 19,000 Americans were killed. Tens of thousands more were wounded, captured, or listed as missing. But the German offensive had failed in its central purpose. It had not reached the Meuse. It had not split the Allied armies. Antwerp remained far beyond reach. After the war, Allied intelligence officers questioned captured German commanders about their planning for the Ardennes offensive. The answers were revealing. German staff calculations assumed the Americans would be slow to respond. They expected confusion, delays, and friction at every level of command. They believed it would take at least a week for the Allies to mount a coordinated counterattack. That assumption shaped everything. Fuel allocations, march schedules, operational objectives. Patton's counterattack shattered that timetable. German commanders later acknowledged that Third Army's speed forced them to fight defensively far sooner than planned. Momentum was lost. Fuel was burned faster than expected. Units intended for exploitation were diverted into holding actions. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served on the German general staff, later described Patton as the most aggressive operational commander the Allies possessed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, was more direct. They had expected Patton to react quickly. They had not expected him to be ready. The difference was decisive. When the war ended, the official histories of the Ardennes focused on surprise and recovery. They described the German breakthrough, the Allied response, and the eventual defeat of the offensive. What they rarely emphasized was preparation. The intelligence failure at the highest levels was not one of ignorance. The information existed. 15 German divisions did not vanish without trace. Oscar W. Koch had tracked them. He had identified the concentration. He had named the Ardennes as the target and placed the timing within weeks of the actual attack. His assessment was circulated, it was read, and it was dismissed. The prevailing belief that the war was nearly over shaped every interpretation. Evidence that contradicted that belief was treated as anomaly rather than warning. Patton made a different choice. He did not claim certainty. He prepared for possibility. Those 11 days, from December 9th to December 19th, were invisible on the battlefield. No shots were fired, no lines moved. But in headquarters rooms and map studies, an entire army was quietly turned in anticipation of a disaster no one else believed would happen. When Eisenhower asked his question at Verdun, Patton's answer sounded impossible. It was only impossible if preparation began that day. It had not. The relief of Bastogne was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not recklessness. It was the product of listening to intelligence when it was inconvenient, trusting subordinates when consensus said they were wrong, and acting before permission was granted. In war, intelligence does not win battles. Action does. And action only comes in time if someone prepares before the moment arrives. That was the difference.